Helga, we have a series of events occurring which are portending a major change in the world as part of an ongoing process. There's the BRICS conference, which is coming up next week in South Africa, with many nations beyond the BRICS members participating. And there's a conference ongoing in Moscow today titled Global Security Realities in a Multipolar World, uh, which has more than 70 nations participating and is providing a glimpse of what we might expect next week at the BRICS summit. So there's an ongoing effort at the same time from the so-called Western nations to sabotage the fight to end colonialism. What can you tell us about how this battle is shaping up?
Well, I think the establishments in the West are so far refusing to recognize that their policies have caused a boomerang to occur, or these policies boomeranged, and there was a tremendous blowback because the sanctions policy against Russia has not hurt Russia. It has hurt especially Europe and there especially Germany. The confiscation of assets has led to a de-dollarization, and the general geopolitical policies have led now to a situation where China and Russia are in a cemented strategic partnership, which all efforts to try to divide will fail. And you have an absolute, major strategic revolt, one can say, from the side of the developing countries who absolutely don't want to be under the yoke of colonialism anymore. So, I think that the best image I could come up with to, give it all a metaphor is the fact that when Foreign Minister Baerbock tried to fly into the Indo-Pacific, she had to return with her plane 2 times because of a technical failure, supposedly, of the plane. And the plane had to put a lot of kerosene into the ocean to be able to land again so shortly after take-up. So, then she had to cancel her entire visit, and obviously the opportunity to send nice pictures home for the credulous failed completely. And there were many comments in the international media, some of them quite schadenfroh, basically saying this is typical for German politics these days. They can't get anything done anymore. And there is something to it, because if you look at all the many failures of infrastructure, of punctuality of the trains, and I could make a very long list, it is the failure of a wrong policy, especially the green policy, which now is leading to the destruction of Germany. So, this image of Baerbock not being able to fly to the Indo-Pacific is sort of the synonym where things stand. And, people in the West, I'm not talking about the establishments, I'm talking about the people, the populations, they have to recognize that there are changes which cannot be remedied by going back to the old ways. One is that, the result of all of these policies of eastward expansion of NATO over 30 years and all the subsequent developments which happened has led to a situation where it's very obvious that Russia has made a decision that they are no longer counting on politicians in the West. They're no longer trying to, somehow find people in Europe, the United States, for sure not, to have a peaceful policy or to have a policy of disarmament and, somehow trying to solve problems through diplomacy. And they are now reorientating. I think the relationship between Russia and China is one thing. There are some people in Europe who still are trying to either appeal to Russia or to China with the intent to get them to cut the relationship between Russia and China. I think this is absolutely condemned to fail. It completely misestimates the resolve of these two countries who have drawn their conclusions out of Western policies. And it has completely backfired also in respect to the policy of the developing countries, who, because of the Chinese option of cooperating with the Belt and Road Initiative for the last 10 years, have now seen for the first time to have an alternative to the neoliberal system, which basically put them into a situation where they could not overcome their dependency on Western credits, which had conditionalities attached to them, which basically prohibited any real industrial development of the developing countries. So they have basically drawn the conclusion. And if you listen to all of these speeches from Africa, from the development of the Sahel zone, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Algeria, South Africa, Zimbabwe, you get a completely new tone where it is very clear that they are saying openly, we had it with your colonial policies. Now, there was just a week ago or so, the Russia-African Summit in St. Petersburg, where our Schiller Institute representative from France, who is the head of the Africa desk, basically was the only Western representative who was invited to the summit. And he made an absolutely fantastic report about it. You should go on our website and look at this, and you can retweet it and resend it in any possible ways, because people have to know that that is the new spirit of the global South. So I think, I think these things cannot be reversed. I don't think you can go back to the old geopolitical game. I think the only way out would be that enough people in Western Europe and the United States understand that they have to move to cooperate with the global majority. That means a new paradigm, a new concept of international relations, which regards every country as an equal, which respects the sovereignty of all, which goes for a mutual win-win policy in the interest of everybody. And that will be a new experience for some of the people who still have been used to think in the old colonial ways. But it's a very hopeful development for mankind as a whole. And the more quickly we can get, at least some portions of the establishments in North America and Europe to recognize that, the better, because the continuation of trying to stick to geopolitical aims can only lead to the demise of the West. And that is unfortunately an option also, because if Europe does not find a way to cooperate with the global South, Germany right now is about to crash against the wall and become completely deindustrialized with unbelievable social consequences. So we are really at a epochal change, but of a quite different way than Chancellor Scholz talked about more than a year ago, because it is the transition from the colonial age to the modern age, where colonialism will be a question of the past.
We want to welcome everybody to today's Manhattan Project show. It's a special show in which, as you've just heard, Helkesep LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute Express, is happening on the eve of at least one conference, which intends to advance the idea of the end of colonialism. Now, the conference, which will be happening on August 22nd through 25th in Johannesburg, South Africa, is called BRICS and Africa: Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development, and Inclusive Multilateralism. Now, BRICS refers to the nations Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's an association that was created back in June of 2009, but it was a continuation of something that had begun on April 18th of 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia, the famous Bandung Conference, which was the first meeting of what became known as the non-aligned nations, those nations that did not want to be aligned either with what was called the First World, which was sort of the world of the European, Euro-American alliance. Think about it as sort of the NATO of the period of 1949 and some extension, or the Second World, which was seen to be primarily the world defined by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations. But there was another individual, non-aligned group called the Third World. That's where why that term was used, and tends to also still be used as echoed to this day. But what will be happening is that a conference will be being held. President Xi Jinping of China will be there. Narendra Modi of India will be there, and Vladimir Putin will not be there for reasons that have to do with much of what we'll be getting into in other parts of our story today. And President Lula da Silva of Brazil will also be there. There's been a lot of pressure on certain nations not to attend. For example, Argentina, which very much wanted to be there, but which is now decided apparently not to have their president go, although they will be in attendance. And it's happening in a certain configuration in which one might remember that it was not that long ago that several African nations journeyed to both Kiev and also Moscow to meet with Zelensky and Vladimir Putin to express their view of why there had to be peace restored in Europe. Though some of those African leaders, by the way, later at a conference that happened in St. Petersburg, which has just recently concluded, expressed that it was their view that this was not really a war between Ukraine and Russia, but a war between NATO and Russia. The president of Eritrea, in particular, Afwerki, made certain very important remarks to that effect. But what is happening is that Helga Zepp-LaRouche is doing an intervention, leading an intervention, which is in line with and in the spirit of things that were done by her and by her late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, really from the 1970s. In fact, immediately after the taking of the dollar off the gold standard on August 15th, 1971, Lyndon LaRouche began to work on programs that were intended to figure out, particularly in the period of 73, 74, just 50 years ago, how the emerging nations of Africa in particular, as well as other areas in Asia, could, in fact, throw off the shackles of colonialism that still exist. If you talk, for example, about Africa and you talk about French Africa, there are 14 nations in Africa that have the value of their currencies determined in France by the French Treasury, by something called the CFA franc. And so to this day, at this moment, those nations have a colonized relationship from a financial standpoint to the so-called original colonizing nation. So what is happening is that this intervention that is being done by Helga Zepp-LaRouche begins with a statement she just wrote called "Appeal to the Citizens of the Global North. We must support the construction of a new, just world economic order." And it harkens back to a certain campaign that was done and launched by the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche during the 1970s. This statement is not a standalone. It will come accompanied with a series of other documents, among them Helga's 10 principles for a new international security and development architecture, and a fully worked out plan and program for economic development of the world, which is a plan for 1.5 billion jobs. This is something that was worked out. You see it there on your screen, the LaRouche plan to reopen the U.S. economy. But of course, there aren't 1.5 billion people in the United States. In fact, there are, that's a fifth of the population. The United States is about a fourth of that population. This is a plan to do what the American system economist Henry Carey talked about. If you want to deal with the problems that people talk about of so-called immigration or other such names which are given to these problems, human trafficking is another name given to it. But what it really is it's a destruction of the powers of labor. It's a recycling of the world's labor force. It's a ratcheting down of the living standards of various nations and a violation of the rights of people globally, the right to be productive and have sovereign, independent nation states. And so those are portions of that project, of that package rather. But the final portion, which we want to talk about here for a moment, is from 1975. It was a draft done by Lyndon LaRouche at that time called How the International Development Bank Will Work. Lyndon LaRouche wrote many, in fact, literally hundreds of documents concerning not merely monetary and financial matters, but the relationship between physical economy, technological progress, and credit, and the provision of credit for the purposes of allowing a society to grow, prosper, and develop. And back in the 1970s, at the point that the International Monetary Fund and World Bank played an outsized role, particularly for those newly emerging nations of Africa, in determining economic policy, really from London and from Washington, Lyndon LaRouche proposed another way that things could be organized. There are echoes of what Lyndon LaRouche proposed in things such as the new development bank of the BRICS nations, presently headed by the former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. And many of the things that are going to be discussed at the conference are already congruent with certain elements of Lyndon LaRouche's proposals. But there's a sort of deeper conception that not only is contained in the documents that you're seeing there, and we're putting this together as a package. We want to have people in Europe and in the United States study the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche so that they might understand why this approach, this economic approach that we are proposing, is the only basis for preventing thermonuclear war in the short term. There is not actually any set of peace negotiations that will do more than postpone the drive toward war. Even various disarmament and related talks, as important as they may be, will not solve the problem. To solve the problem, something else has to be placed into motion, placed into circulation, and that is the conception of what constitutes economic development, what constitutes sovereign and independent technological progress, which allows for every nation to be independently on a pathward, upward trajectory, such that its population grows and thrives and prospers. It's our view that the world needs more people. The world is not only not overpopulated, but it is underpopulated. It is overpopulated with fools, but it is underpopulated with human beings. And what we need to do is to create a conversation about this, a dialogue about this, a controversy about this, which is exactly what we intend to do. There's a special report that was filed by one of the members of the Schiller Institute who traveled to St. Petersburg for a conference which has just recently concluded, which involved Vladimir Putin and the heads of state of over 20 African nations that dared to come to see him. As we know, the International Criminal Court has these charges against Putin. And one of the things that came up around this St. Petersburg, Africa summit was who had the guts, who had the courage to go and to talk with him. What happened was that besides the people, the heads of state and other representatives of the African nations that attended, Schiller Institute representative Sébastien Peramoni also was there, and he filed the following report.
Bonjour à tous. Je suis Sébastien.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sébastien Peramoni, head of the Schiller Institute's Africa office, in which capacity I had the opportunity to participate in the Russia-Africa Summit last week. It took place in the beautiful city of St. Petersburg, Russia, on July 27th and 28th. It was a historic summit, a symbol of the changing times that we're living in. For us, for the Schiller Institute, it was historic because we were the only Western organization invited to take part in the summit. Why? Because since its founding by Helmut LaRouche in 1984, the Schiller Institute has fought for world peace, mutual development, and dialogue between civilizations in the spirit of Bandung and the non-aligned movement, to emancipate people from financial oligarchy, from imperialism, and from neocolonialism. I'd like to take this opportunity to issue a warning to our African friends, because for the last week, I've seen a lot of analysis, a lot of experts making videos on the internet announcing the end of France-Afrique, denouncing neocolonialism, which they seem to have discovered last week. As we all know, France-Afrique is going to try to co-opt this movement for the emancipation of African peoples with its cohort of agents and experts, because it knows that the death warrant for neocolonialism has already been signed and nothing can stop it. Let's just recall the Africa-France summit in Montpellier organized by Emmanuel Macron, which I also participated in, organized by his Presidential Council for Africa, where, in a magnificent communication session, African pseudo-intellectuals came to tell President Macron their so-called 4 truths about French policy in Africa. But they were, in fact, nothing more than servile lackeys of this neo-colonial institution. But Africans are no longer fooled, as we've seen over the last few days in Niger, after the Central African Republic, Mali, Burkina Faso, the very strong will of the people, and of young people in particular, to free themselves from the criminal policy that has been pursued by Western institutions since African independence, with the military and monetary agreements imposed on those countries, which are now freeing themselves from it. Let me remind you that all the countries of the CFA zone, this colonial currency, the 14 French-speaking countries of the CFA zone, they are all ranked among the 50 poorest countries in the world in the UN Human Development Index report published for the years 2021-2022. So the presence of the Schiller Institute at this conference is very important because it shows the world that Africa and Russia have friends in Europe, which is why we were invited. And that if France has a future outside neocolonialism, outside imperialism, it will be with us. Africans know this, and that's why we were invited to Mali in January 2021, between the 2 revolutions taking place in the country at the time, to demonstrate the union of the French and Malian peoples against the policies of the financial oligarchy. I say it here loud and clear. We no longer want military intervention by the West in general, and France in particular, on the African continent. Historic, then, for its importance in the global paradigm shift towards a multipolar, de-dollarized world based on mutual respect and development. As Vladimir Putin said at a press conference at the Russia-Africa Summit, and I quote, "The summit has again confirmed the firm resolve of both Russia and Africa to continue developing mutually beneficial partnership and seeking new forms and areas for cooperation." And this is what I was able to observe on site. Despite strong pressure from Western institutions on African leaders and governments not to attend the summit, the Russia-Africa Forum was attended by official delegations from 48 countries. 27 countries were represented by the head of state or prime minister, as well as by the continent's 5 largest integration associations. To name but the 2 most important such attendees, the African Union was represented by its current chairman, Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of the Comoros, and by Moussa Faki Mohammed, Chairman of the African Union Commission, as well as 17 heads of state in person. This summit leads to a revolution in world affairs concerning the establishment of the multipolar world. First, a final declaration from the summit in which participants declared their commitment to build together a new, more just, multipolar architecture of world order based on the sovereign equality of states and mutually beneficial cooperation. A declaration on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. A declaration on cooperation to ensure international information security, because, as you know, the war on fake news is everywhere. A declaration on strengthening cooperation in the fight against terrorism. And finally, a Russia-Africa action plan for 2023 to 2026 to prepare for the full implementation of the agreements signed at the summit. As Anton Kobyakov, advisor to the Russian president and executive secretary of the Russia-Africa Events Organizing Committee, put it, there were over 9,000 participants, 1,000 representatives of Russian and African companies, official delegations from various countries, of course, but also civil society organizations. African companies were present in large numbers, with displays all over the convention center, showcasing their handicrafts and the manufacture of various African products, as well as Russian partners on site. A total of 59 roundtables were organized, with 457 speakers focusing on 4 main areas. The new global economy, which is the main topic. The second, cooperation in science and technology. The third, the humanitarian and social sphere, working together for a new quality of life. And the fourth was integrated security and the sovereign development of every nation in the world. And strangely enough, none of these speakers were from the West, except for the Schiller Institute. And there was also a journalist from France 24 whom I met. It's also worth noting the exceptional presence of Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil and now head of the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank. During her discussion with Vladimir Putin, he recalled that it was in 2014 that he and Dilma Rousseff initiated the creation of this financial structure, and that the members of the BRICS, and I quote Vladimir Putin, are not here to ally themselves against anyone, but to work in the interests of everyone, and that this also applies to the financial sector. In other words, the de-dollarization of the global economy is underway. I was able to attend a large number of panels, each more fascinating than the last. I'll just mention a few of them here. In the first panel, with the presence of the president of Zimbabwe, Emerson Mnangagwa, who gave a very clear clarification. There was no embellishment. It was clear. It was precise. Denouncing the stranglehold of colonialism and imperialism, in his own words, he declared that there was a globalist order fighting against the global South, but that with the progressive nations like Russia and China, we will win. He denounced the West, which for the past 100 years has prevented us from achieving real independence, but has come to lecture us on democracy and finance puppet opposition groups. His words speak for themselves. Finally, he announced that Zimbabwe would be making a qualitative leap forward in all areas of its physical economy, with the implementation of the Science and Technology 2030 program. Furthermore, in an exchange with the Russian president, which was published during the summit, the Zimbabwean president declared that, in view of the sanctions imposed on our two countries, Russia and Zimbabwe, and the resulting difficulties in undertaking transactions denominated in US dollars, Zimbabwe agrees to seek autonomous alternative solutions and the use of other forms of payment for various transactions. I am pleased that the Russian Federation has already accomplished this thanks to, or despite, the sanctions imposed. We see de-dollarization again. In 2020, I wrote a book entitled Voir l'Afrique avec les yeux du futur, Seeing Africa with the Eyes of the Future. The first chapter is devoted to the monetary sovereignty of each African country. The second is on space, the development of space technologies in Africa, and the third on the development of civilian nuclear power in Africa, a subject that is considered taboo. But not taboo at the Russia-Africa Summit. The first panel could not have been clearer. The first panel of the summit, Atoms for Peace, which was a historic program. There is currently only one nuclear power plant in operation on the African continent, in South Africa. But a nuclear power plant is currently under construction with the Russian nuclear company Rosatom at Al Daba in Egypt. And Rosatom has committed itself, and I quote what was repeated during the first panel, to the following: to supply Russian nuclear fuel for the entire life of the plant, staff training, a school has been set up in Egypt to train nuclear engineers to manage the plant themselves, and to support Egyptian partners in operating and maintaining the plant for the first 10 years. After that, through the transfer of knowledge and technology, they'll be able to run the nuclear plant themselves. A large number of countries are interested in civil nuclear power. Ghana, Nigeria, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, which has announced that the first nuclear power plant should be connected to the grid by 2031, a very ambitious project, only 7 years' time. Burkina Faso has also officially shown its interest in nuclear power on Burkinabe territory. Present at this first panel was someone you might already know, Princy Mthombeni, founder of Africa for Nuclear, who had taken part in a Schiller Institute conference already in April 2022. She once again denounced the hypocrisy of Western policies on sustainable development and energy transition, which are opposed to the development of nuclear power in Africa. Of course, here in the West, we swear by low-intensity energies. In response, Ibrahim Uwizeye, the Minister of Hydraulics, Energy and Mining for the Republic of Burundi, went on to say that his country wants access to nuclear energy because it's a small territory with a small surface area, and solar energy takes up a lot of space and is therefore inefficient, as he said, for a country like his. We see how Lyndon LaRouche's ideas on energy flux density are now being publicly and consistently defended by ministers from certain African countries. At this first panel, as has already been stated, one of the strategic challenges facing every country in the world today is the implementation of technologies capable of ensuring energy security, of guaranteeing the sustainable development of various sectors of the economy, and strengthening the country's scientific and human capacities. In parallel, there was a second panel on space, which I wasn't able to attend as they were at the same time, but which advocated the same type of approach, of accelerating economic development and of improving people's standards of living. And of course, to train African youth to the highest technological level. A number of agreements were signed to this effect at the Russia-Africa Forum. And finally, I'd like to mention a very interesting panel on the Eurasian African Economic Union, entitled Horizons for Cooperation. It featured the exceptional participation of Sergei Glaziev, a longtime friend of the Schiller Institute, who did us the honor of granting us an interview, which you can find on the Institut Schiller website. In the interview, Glaziev developed what had been developed in this panel on partnership agreements beyond Russia. For example, the Eurasian Economic Union, which concerns several other countries, such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and others. The expansion of this cooperation between these countries in Africa. We've already signed agreements with Egypt and Angola, and many other projects are in the pipeline. So we're seeing a huge expansion. And I'd like to thank him personally on behalf of the Schiller Institute for granting us this interview during the Russia-Africa Summit, because I know he was very busy. One of the highlights of the summit was the many cultural and sport initiatives put in place to establish a genuine dialogue between Russian and African youth. It was fascinating to see all the exchanges between the two countries, which everyone agreed still need to get to know and discover each other. Among other initiatives, the Friendship Games were announced, to be held in September 2024 in Moscow and Yekaterinburg, to bring people together through youth and friendship and to get to know each other. A youth program was also discussed at a roundtable with young Russian and African leaders on education, science, and technology, and a World Youth Festival to bring together the world's most progressive young people was announced for 2024 in Russia.
2024 et réunira les jeunes les plus progressistes, a-t-on dit, de la planète, qui a été donc annoncé pour 2024 en Russie.
So, there you have it. A huge number of scientific, technological, sporting, cultural, and intellectual exchanges that were absolutely fascinating, not to mention the many cultural events that took place on site. I'd like to mention just two. The third International Ballet Festival of the Inopraktika School, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, to introduce the Russian ballet tradition to an African audience. And an African Music Festival held on July 29th with a concert by African stars who came to introduce Russians to African music. So you can see all of this sharing, this ferment of cultural exchange. In conclusion, we were able to meet and discuss with a large number of political representatives, Pan-African activists, and civil society organizations. We were interviewed by numerous media outlets, including Sputnik Africa, Algerian media, Afrique Media, and many others, on which we were able to give the Schiller Institute's vision of this new dialogue, this concert of nations, far removed from the criminal neo-colonial policies of NATO, the City of London, and Wall Street. And at no time, it must be said, was there any animosity towards us, despite the sanctions policies pursued by the West against Russia and Africa. This is borne out, for example, in the opening words of Nathalie Yam, who granted me an interview during the summit, and which you can read here to show you the state of mind that prevailed at the summit. Hello, Natalie. Very nice to meet you. We're both at the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg, and there's a bit of a paradox in our interview, because I'm French, and I know that you are not allowed in my country. So, can you tell us where this French animosity towards you comes from? Well, perhaps you should ask those who feel this animosity, because I don't feel any towards France. I feel resistance to French policy in Africa. As I said at the outset, it is very important for us to be present at this summit because the Schiller Institute has always fought for peace through mutual development and dialogue between civilizations. And that was the whole point of this second Russia-Africa summit. We support the popular revolutions currently underway in Africa because the future of Africa depends on it, as does France's honor in putting an end to neocolonialism. This is a historic moment. It's up to us to rise to the...
Forces associated with Lyndon LaRouche have been involved in the issue of African development for a very long time. We want to thank Sebastian Perimoni from the Schiller Institute for what he just went through. And if you just tuned in, that was a report that he was presenting about a conference that had happened in Russia, St. Petersburg to be exact, involving Vladimir Putin and what he described, what Sebastian described as over 9,000 representatives from various nations of Africa who were there to talk about the prospects for development of that continent over the next century, and of course immediate prospects as well. I just like to note on a sort of a both personal and relevant note, this is a book that was published by Associates for Lyndon LaRouche, then involved in an organization called the Fusion Energy Foundation. And that book was called The Industrialization of Africa. That was done in 1978. And on the back of that book, we featured African children of that time, most of whom would be in their 50s now. So we don't come to this matter late, although it's fine if you do come to it late, but we have very clear ideas about what we think needs to be done. We have also very clear ideas about why it wasn't done when we were proposing it, and others were proposing it back in the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s and the aughts and the teens and now in the 20s. It's important to stay in the battle and stay focused on what it is you have to do. And in that regard, in that light, I'd like to introduce a friend of mine. I've known him for almost 50 years. I think it is 50 years now. I've been involved in the fight around Africa. He's part of the Africa desk of the Executive Intelligence Review, Dave Cherry. Dave, welcome to today's show. And besides whatever remarks you have to make of your own, I wonder if you have any response to some of what you saw there with Sebastien's report.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm seeing the video of Sebastien for the third time, and I must say it was as exciting the third time as it was when I first saw it. And this does reflect very much the new state of Africa, where there is a lot of excitement about development and about independence, true independence, including the freedom to industrialize your society. And more, the expression development, which has multiple meanings, multiple contradictory meanings, more and more the term development is being replaced by the term industrialization. Some of you know our publication, the Schiller Institute publication from 2017, Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, a Vision of an Economic Renaissance, written by Hussein Askari and Jason Ross. So that's kind of a baseline. It goes through what's happening in Africa and in terms of physical economy, and also what can happen. So it's a kind of a roadmap. I want to report today on just a few indicators of of where Africa is. There are three major, very major projects that are worthy of special mention. First of all, Egypt. The President El-Sisi, you may remember, he widened the Suez Canal, increased its capacity, and by virtue of several steps. Then he initiated a nuclear power plant in the Western Desert at El Dabaa that is now being built. He has created a new capital city. If you've ever been to Cairo, you know it's a 24/7 traffic jam. So that capital city is now built and people are moving into it. But even more spectacular is that Egypt is now building 15 new cities, of 1 to 3 billion people each in capacity. Some of these are in the far north in the Delta region. Some of them are lined up just to the west of the Nile River, so this is an amazing development, and of course you don't see much of that in our press, certainly. Another major project has been in Nigeria, where President Buhari, who's just finished his second term, brought in modern rails, not one, but several, crisscrossing the country, not crisscrossing exactly, but connecting major cities from the coast to the capital in Abuja, going north to Kaduna and Kano, and he even insisted upon building a further segment going uh, up into what is it? Yeah, that part is on the Niger border. So he said we've got to express the idea of that we are building something for Africa and not just mere national development. That was done. I mean, that was approved, and that segment is being built now. The current president of Nigeria is not very much in that spirit, but it's most likely that he'll be swept along by what we're seeing in Africa in general. The third project is called the MSEZ. It's a special economic zone called, I'm missing my words here. Hang on a sec. Anyhow, it's a major industrial zone in the far north of South Africa, in Limpopo, which is one of the poorest parts of the country. It's on the Zimbabwe border. It will have metallurgical capacities. I've got to refer to my notes here, excuse me. It's got everything from agro-industrial production, including producing fertilizers, phosphates, to ferrochrome and very high quality steel and stainless steel. There's nothing like this. There's no other project with this scope anywhere in Africa that I know of. It includes light manufacturing also. Now, that project has seemed to be slow and moving, but there are two indications that it's now really going somewhere, and one is that the mass media has suddenly opened up, or at least one of the mass media, Mail and Guardian, has opened up with a major attack saying this is an emergency because this project is about to happen. And it's all this green crap, right? So, and I also, from my contacts, I know that that indeed this project is going forward very well. But these three projects, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, this is not Africa. This is not enough. So if we look at Africa as a whole, we could we notice that there's been a lot of port building of deep water ports. There's the Durban port, which has been around for a while, but it's being extensively improved and expanded with a Filipino private company as a partner. South Africa is also just sending out bids for partners for a brand new port at Bogo Bay on the western coast, just south of the southern tip of Namibia. And Nigeria, in January, President Buhari, before he left office, he opened the brand new deepwater port at Lekki, and in Dakar, Senegal, a deepwater port is being built primarily with Western financing. But deepwater ports are not telling us too much, because a deepwater port does not distinguish between the colonial approach to Africa and the African approach to Africa. They cut both ways. So let's ask ourselves, what about the beneficiation of South Africa's minerals? There is a lot of part of the enthusiasm in Africa takes the form of saying we must not allow our raw materials to be exported without Africa being part of the production process, namely the beneficiation of minerals. And the foreign minister of South Africa, Naledi Pandor, was in DR Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and she told the meeting, and this was public, do not sign any contract that does not provide for beneficiation. So in Zimbabwe, there's now a law making it illegal to export lithium without first being processed in Zimbabwe. In South Africa, there's now a law forbidding the export of gold without beneficiation, and that law is in South Africa is going to be extended to other minerals as well. So that's the ambition, is to have Africa beneficiate its mineral wealth. I want to talk about one particular project to make a point. Excuse me. There is a company, I can't find it right now. There it is. A company called African Chrome Fields. Is based in South Africa, but it's international. And all the way back in 2014, they launched a smelting plant for beneficiation of minerals, and I guess of chrome. And they had to ask themselves, well, how can we do this without electricity? Zimbabwe is not a country that has a large production of electricity. So they worked out a chemistry to use chemical heat to reach the necessary heats in order to convert raw chrome into ferrochrome, which is a specialized ferroalloy that's used in various steels, including stainless steel manufacturing. And they're getting an excellent result. They're getting a very high quality ferrochrome. But what's the point here? The point is that in general, Africa is not going to be able to even beneficiate its own minerals without a great increase in its electricity production. Electricity is the lifeblood of the physical economy in any modern society. So now we're at a sticking point. Africa is being told you can use hydropower, you can use wind, you can use solar, but you must not use your hydrocarbons. Africa has lots of coal. It has natural gas, but you must not use those. You can export them to Europe, but you can't use them. John Kerry, a member of the Anglo-American elite, has been on a mission to Africa to insist upon this. So how is Africa going to beneficiate its minerals with wind and solar and hydropower? Hydropower is not a universal solution. Most of Africa's lakes are very shallow. So if you get a years-long drought, which Southern Africa did have in the 2010s, hydropower is not much of a solution. So nuclear is if you start today, it's at least 10 years away under current highly restrictive regulatory regimes. Those regimes could be improved, but it still takes years. So the answer is to burn natural gas to drive, to boil water and to drive a turbine. This is a form of electricity production that is not too expensive and it doesn't take too long to do it. The South African Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Gwede Mantashe, for some time was on a almost solo campaign. He was the champion, saying Africa must use its hydrocarbons. And he was joined by President Buhari of Nigeria and Buhari's Vice President Osinbajo, and this message is now spreading. Is both found in the Middle East. What do I want to say here? That there's a champion from the Middle East who is telling Africa that too. Now in South Africa, a new organization has been formed to back up Mantashe called the Engineering League of Progress, ELP. It has 1,000 members who are African engineers, technicians, technologists, and academics. And they are rallying behind the campaign that Africa must burn its hydrocarbons. And so that's where we are. Given the high spirits and determination that we're seeing in Africa right now, I'm confident that the green ideology is on its way down. It's already on its way down in at least in South Africa. Thank you.
High spirits and determination. We now, I believe, finally have Princy Mthombeni with us. We're having a few technical problems before, but I think she's with us at this point. Is that correct?
Hello,
Hi.
Dennis. I'm here. Hi, thank you so much.
Oh, there. Good. Glad we finally got you. Princy is the founder of Africa for Nuclear. She's also a communications specialist, and she has triumphed over the limitations of electrical deprivation in South Africa for the moment. So I don't know how much you actually heard of our previous show because you may not have been connected, but we've played the video from our friend Sebastian, and David's just given his presentation, so you now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Lovely to see you, David.
Nice to see you, Princy.
Yes. So basically, today I'm just going to answer a question of why should we pay attention to the importance of youth engagement and broader geographical diversity in the nuclear sector now. Dennis, last year, the International Energy Agency reported that in order to reach net zero carbon emissions, nuclear power capacity needs to double to 812 gigawatt by 2050 from the current 413 gigawatt. And this anticipated nuclear power growth plan is not just an isolated plan of the IEA, but it's rather supported by the activities that we see being taken by nuclear stakeholders in different countries. For example, the Hinkley Point C nuclear power plant, which is currently under construction, as well as the approval of the Sizewell C site in the United Kingdom. Egypt, India, China, and others are also currently building nuclear power plants. And furthermore, many countries that have signed to go to the direction of nuclear power, such as Poland, Hungary, Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, Uganda, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and many others. I think Sebastian mentioned some of them. And this is all evidence that the IEA report is not just a report in isolation, but is backed by activities that I just mentioned. And over and above these big nuclear power plants, there's a huge interest in small modular reactors, which are basically earmarked by almost all developed economies. For example, United States NuScale, TerraPower, Canada's Starcore, UK's Rolls-Royce, and many others. Some of these programs are attracting the interest from billionaires such as Bill Gates, who are partnering with the industry. And some of these SMR plans are in partnership with their country's Department of Energy and sometimes backed by development finance institutions like NuScale, which plans to bid for SMRs in South Africa. Also, like UK's Rolls-Royce, backed by the UK government. Same thing with Rosatom of Russia. With all of this being said, Dennis, it's clear that nuclear industry is going to be the technology, is going to be the technology that is part of the equation for the next 60 to 80 years. Now, the question is, why would the youth not take part in these developments, considering the fact that they will inherit these programs anyway? Therefore, every attempt must be made to seek to educate the youth and highlight that in the midst of clean energy technologies, nuclear is going to play a crucial role. The clean technologies I'm referring to are renewables energy, particularly wind and solar, backed by battery energy storage system, gas to power, as well as nuclear power. These are just three technologies, clean technologies into the future if we just put aside hydro and hydrogen energy. Seeing that nuclear power is going to be part of these technologies, which are going to be relevant for the next 60 or 30 to 50 years, it's clear that the youth involvement is critical because the assets are going to these assets are going to need people with knowledge and interest to look after them. Every countries, even countries that are not leading the development of nuclear, but that will be procuring nuclear for their own energy security. The youth citizens of those countries must be empowered with knowledge and accumulate practical experience so that they are able to run those nuclear assets in their own countries, look after them, understand them, and improve and optimize on them for the future developments, particularly countries in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, where nuclear is normally procured from nuclear technology leading expert countries and not necessarily developed there. But nuclear is not only about nuclear power, it is also about nuclear medicine, seawater desalination, agriculture, etc. For instance, in Africa, even though South Africa and Egypt have nuclear medicine capabilities, other countries have semi-programs of research reactors. With regards to the seawater desalination, the nuclear deal between Russia and Egypt includes seawater desalination. These are all opportunities for the youth. So if it works in Egypt, countries in Africa who have coastline will most likely follow Egypt, especially those impacted by drought. In terms of diversity, Zambia is busy with a Center for Nuclear Science and Technology, which includes the large component of students who go to Russia to study nuclear. In fact, the very same concept of the Center for Nuclear Science and Technology is a practical step of building the nuclear capacity and capability of the country. Last year, Rwanda announced a total of 100 young graduates with different levels in the industry of nuclear science and technology in what is seen as major boost for the industry that is new in Rwanda. It's probably the same with South America as well as Southeast Asia countries. As it is well known that KEPCO of South Korea is now one of the nuclear power vendors, but it undertook them to make efforts to get their citizens, particularly the youth, to learn about nuclear, which is what India is also doing. Perhaps India may end up becoming a nuclear vendor, just like South Korea. In my country, South Africa, we also have women who are leading in the nuclear industry, such as the Chief Executive Officer of the National Nuclear Regulator, Ms. Ditebo Hohomu, and the Chief Executive Officer of the National Radioactive Waste Disposal Institute, Dr. Margaret Mkhosi. If these phenomenal women had not entered the nuclear industry at a very young age, they would not be leading these big entities today, especially with the evolution of SMRs, where it is anticipated that many countries with small grids and industries that are intensive energy users are going to be placing orders after they become commercially viable and affordable. In fact, in South Africa, Rolls-Royce of the UK and Rosatom of Russia are currently in talks with the city of eThekwini about SMRs, including the floating reactors. The city on its own has nuclear capacity of up to 900 megawatt electricity planned for future as part of its energy mix, which includes renewables, wind and solar, in particular, gas, biomass, and even clean coal. These kinds of developments, like municipalities anticipating SMRs to be part of their future plans, are quite exciting. I recently attended the Russia-Africa Economic and Humanitarian Forum. During the summit, the participants affirmed their commitments to jointly building a new, fairer, multipolar architecture of the world order based on the sovereign equality states and mutually beneficial cooperation. It was very interesting to see countries like Zimbabwe and Ethiopia signing agreements with a Russian state-owned company, Rosatom, to cooperate on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, or nuclear technology rather. And this shows that African countries are starting to get serious about solving energy poverty, especially in having nuclear as part of the energy mix. And therefore, the youth have to take interest so that one day they own the industry, come up with new technological breakthroughs, and to advance not only improvements to the technologies, but also human lives. Thank you so much, Dennis, for your time.
Much. And what we'll do here is that they already have several questions to kind of do a division of labor as a house will do this. I think the first question we'll take will come from Kynan. If you can come up on the screen, because you have a very particular question to Princy. So let's start with that, and then I've got one for David. Okay, he's saying he needs about a minute for this to come up. And while he's doing that, let me just indicate that I found what you were just describing, particularly in the area of the small modular reactors and the floating nuclear reactors, to be a rather important thing to return to in the course of the discussion. Also, the use of and the thinking about nuclear power in smaller nations like Rwanda, Burundi, places where we are not talking about the kind of landmass we're talking about if we're talking about Niger or Nigeria. That will be an important thing to just come back to. I just want to wait and see if Kynan is ready, because I'd rather. Okay, fine. I'm going to go to you first.
Hi. Yeah. Apologies. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, Princy. I really appreciated it. Recently, my friend Jose and we actually did a interview with Oliver Stone, a very prominent film director here in the U.S., and he actually recently made a documentary dedicated to nuclear power called Nuclear Now, and it's been getting very popular here in the States. And it's really opened up people to the positive effects of nuclear power, because people have been sort of brainwashed from this mindset, from the dangers of radiation, from all kinds of different things. So it's been a very powerful intervention, I think, into getting people out of that brainwashing and actually providing a scientific view of what nuclear power is, because people don't have that understanding of it. But I noticed some problems with the documentary, in my view, is that it comes from the standpoint of we're just using this to solve climate change. And I don't think it should be viewed in that way. It really should be viewed as in terms of uplifting humanity, of giving them means of solving energy poverty, of solving of giving more people access to power generation. But I don't really have this view that climate change is such a problem. I mean, I think it's more exaggerated, but Stone is coming at it from that standpoint. Okay, we're going to have nuclear power, but we also got to get rid of but this is just going to be used to get rid of coal, to get rid of petrol, to get rid of fossil fuels, and nuclear power will come in and replace that. So I want to know, since you advocate for this and you've probably encountered many pro-nuclear groups, if they have this view that we should just use it as a remedy for climate change, and what you think about that.
Thank you so much for the question. Number one, I'd like to say we are lucky in Africa, or even in South Africa, because the nuclear now is not that big. People don't know about it. I know about it because I'm a global, nuclear advocate. So I think it's sort of, for me, that's what I was saying, to say the nuclear now has its own market, and Africa is not its market, because of the same reasons that you just mentioned. It portrays nuclear as a replacement of any other energy technologies, particularly fossil fuels, which should not be the case with us. I understand in countries like the US and other countries in Europe, because you already have abundance of energy. So what I do when I advocate for nuclear, I first mention that abundance for all is the priority. Even here in South Africa, when I speak about ESCOM issues, the first thing I say ESCOM must do is to fix what is broken, which are those power plants that have not been maintained for a very long time, before they can consider adding another electricity on the grid, or new electricity on the grid, which now should be nuclear. So it is, you are mentioning a very good point when you say portray nuclear as a replacement of fossil fuels, or maybe over exaggerating climate change. It should not be the direction that we take. But I think I understand why Robert Stone did what he did, because we cannot run away from the fact that this climate change narrative is already there. So it's either you try, those of us who want nuclear to be part of the script, because for me, when I go to COP, I say I'm going to COP to make sure that nuclear is part of this whole script. So I think Robert Stone was also looking at that direction to say, because we cannot stop people from talking about climate change. Rather, if we want to get nuclear as part of it, the script, let's maybe think about ways in which we can seem to be, getting along with what is being communicated, which is climate change. Because nuclear does meet the requirements of climate change, even though some of us know that really the climate change agenda is not what we are trying to push, especially as African continent, which pollutes less than what one country in Europe pollutes. So I get what you're saying, and thank you for mentioning that.
Okay, very good. Now, David, before I go to the question for you, do you have any response or any other comment you want to make on what you just heard, or should we just go right to the question?
No, that's good.
I'm good. Thank you so much.
You're good, fine. And David, you're okay if we now, because we have something for you to respond to. What we're going to do is we're going to play a video, David. Now, this video is from about 10 years ago. It's a program called Shadow War in the Sahara. It was made by one of our associates, actually, with somebody I know. And the section we're going to play, it's about a 3.5 minute section, is just about AFRICOM, that is to say, the Africa Command of the United States, how it evolved, and there's something contended in the narrative. I want you to watch it and then comment. So, go ahead, Kaina.
Deterring and defeating transnational threats, preventing future conflicts, supporting humanitarian and disaster relief efforts, and protecting U.S. security interests. That's the mission of U.S. Africa Command.
They decided that maybe they needed a separate command, a headquarters, that would focus exclusively on Africa's. And so the Bush administration under Donald Rumsfeld, who was running the Pentagon at the time, decided to do that, set up a separate command just for Africa.
The United States is the only country to have divided the world into separate military sectors to monitor and patrol. These are NORTHCOM, PACOM, SOUTHCOM, EUCOM, CENTCOM, and now AFRICOM. Under the stated goals of fighting terrorism and providing humanitarian assistance, AFRICOM implanted itself on the continent, conducting military exercises with a growing number of African countries. But was this the only reason for AFRICOM?
Je pense qu'il y a une corrélation totale entre la lutte antiterroriste et les intérêts américains sur le continent. Ça n'a pas évolué. Dans un premier temps, les Américains laissent la France ou un certain nombre de pays occidentaux assurer la sécurité dans leurs anciennes colonies, mais qu'à long terme, ils restent présents parce que la bagarre à long terme sera vraiment avec la Chine.
Beijing had firmly established itself as a counterweight to French and American interests on the continent. In the first decade of the 21st century, China had overtaken the rest of the world to become Africa's largest trading partner.
Les Chinois sont arrivés sur ce continent au moment où finalement toutes les puissances occidentales, et en particulier les Français, étaient en train de donner des leçons aux Africains en disant il faut faire des élections, il faut aller à la démocratie, et puis surtout il y avait les plans d'ajustement structurel du FMI et de la Banque mondiale. Les Chinois sont arrivés, ils ont dit aux Africains nous on vous donne pas de leçons, on s'ingère pas dans vos affaires politiques. Les dettes, on vous donne tout l'argent. Finalement, les Occidentaux, c'est très bien, ils vous ont annulé les dettes, ils ont passé l'ardoise. Mais nous, auprès de nous, on vous donne des prêts énormes à taux zéro. Donc, ils ont fait le contraire de ce qu'ont fait les Français et les Occidentaux, et ils sont devenus les rois du pétrole, c'est le cas de le dire. Ça veut dire qu'ils ont accès à toutes les matières premières stratégiques.
In this 2010 U.S. State Department cable made public by WikiLeaks, a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State calls China a very aggressive and pernicious economic competitor with no morals.
Ultimately, the aim of the United States in Africa is to develop mechanisms where access to resources that are strategic, that are absolutely essential to several key industries in the United States, as well as access to petroleum is secured. That it also provides a counterweight to China. China is also in somewhat of a race to acquire as many minerals and petroleum and other natural resources that it needs for its industries. The United States, though it may no longer be a major manufacturing power, its military industries are heavily dependent on minerals that can be only sourced in Africa.
So, David, I'd like you to respond to what you just saw, what you think of what it is, and what you think about the arguments, particularly pertaining to China, etc.
Thank you. Yes, AFRICOM was created to ensure the United States especially with mineral resources from Africa. And of course, the other objective of maintaining global hegemony for the United States is also there. Now, there's a lot of buzz that you can hear about the activities of U.S. military in the Middle East or in the Sahel creates as much terrorism as it defeats, or maybe creates more than it defeats. That every time some civilians get killed, AFRICOM has managed to create more terrorists than they killed. Well, the truth is worse than that. I don't wish to make any statement about Algeria as it is today, but Algeria in the 1990s was used by the NATO powers to manufacture false flag terrorists. That program has continued and it has been expanded, and the most comprehensive view of it is in a book by Jeremy Keenan, Keenan. It's called The Dying Sahara, U.S. Imperialism. Sorry, let me. I can't get it on there. Jeremy Keenan, the Dying Imperialism, The Dying Sahara, U.S. Imperialism and Terror in Africa. And Jeremy Keenan is not an outside observer. He has spent a lot of time in the Sahel. He has friends and contacts in governments and among the Tuareg. This expose, I think, is definitive. So I think that's all I need to say.
All right, very good. Now, Princy, it's just something for you to respond to. There were questions, and I'll come to one or two, but this statement is sort of one I'd like to read. It's from an old essay, which was talking about the development of nuclear power in Africa and its relationship to agriculture. And the author said this: the overall development of Africa necessitates a rapid transformation of African agriculture to the most modern, intensive kind. It is impossible to have development and industrialization without simultaneous advances in agricultural production, as traditional forms of agriculture demand and support only low qualities and quantities of labor power. And then it sort of says that this would require a smaller but highly qualified labor force using advanced scientific and industrial inputs to feed a given population. I just bring this up because a significant portion of the total African population, of course, is still agricultural. And of course, there's the transition into the cities, and this is one of the biggest transitions. I think the largest one in human history is presently going on the African continent. A lot of people are not aware, certainly not in the United States, that the median age in Africa is 19, meaning half of the people on the continent are below the age of 19, and half of them are above the age of 19. So just wanted to get your thoughts about the role of what you're talking about in terms of both nuclear technology, but also, as you point out, the use of fossil fuels, which is something that should not be, in your view, or in my view for that matter, prohibited from Africa.
I hope I got what you said. Well, in terms of agricultural development in Africa, I don't think energy should be excluded as the main contributor to having that achieved, because agricultural sector still needs a lot of energy. And well, in terms of nuclear technology playing a big role in it, yes, it definitely has to play a big role in it. And young people basically are going to be part of that role that nuclear technology is playing in terms of agricultural sector on the African continent. I noticed that, especially here in South Africa, the agricultural sector is treated as though it's a special sector that requires, I think, you know, years and years of experience, of which I don't think that's the case. We may we may not talk about the large scale of agricultural sector, but I grew up in an area where men and women had big gardens, and they were farming their own their own vegetables, and we had cows in some of the kettles in some of the homes. So Africans, I believe that they have been playing a big role in the agricultural sector even way before we were energized as the African continent. So yeah, I think that's my response to it, to say I don't think the sector really should be treated as the sector that requires a highly skilled, highly skilled individuals, but the young people that are already here in Africa can play a big role in making sure that the agricultural sector is well managed and is developed. But also we need to start by solving the energy sector first, because so that other sectors can follow.
Yeah, I think that was clear enough. That was the point, that it is an energy intensive. You can't have the development of agriculture unless you have the development of energy. David, do you have anything to say on that? Otherwise, I'll go back to other questions for you.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, it's as I said, and as others have said, that energy is the lifeblood of the physical economy, and that absolutely includes agriculture. For example, a country like South Africa needs a lot of tractors. Well, how do you manufacture tractors? Well, you don't do it without electricity.
Okay, so now there's sort of a characteristic group of questions. I'm going to pose a couple of them together. I don't think it'll be confusing. There is one question first about President Afwerki's remarks about NATO being at war with Russia, and what you think about that. And the question is being asked from the standpoint of how does that relate to what is going on internationally in the strategic situation. That's a YouTube question. Then there's a question from John from Savannah, Georgia. And he asks this: do you believe that the BRICS currency will be successful in dethroning the US fiat dollar for international trade? There actually is not a BRICS currency yet, but we understand what he's getting at. Specifically, will Russia and China be successful in funding projects in Africa that will help them develop to become stronger trading participants on the world stage without fearing repercussions from the West?
What was the first question that came across the internet?
The first one was about Afwerki saying that NATO was at war with Russia, as opposed to Ukraine being at war with Russia. The famous
okay.
thing.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's true. There's nothing more to be said. It's true. The United States is guiding, and the British. The British are very much important, and in many ways leading the leading the strategy in Ukraine, but the two powers are micromanaging, or have been micromanaging, what Zelensky does and what he says. Whether that's going to change now or not, I don't know. As for the second one, I think Russia and China are going to invest a lot in Africa, but they're going to be facing pushback from the Anglo-American powers. What Africa does, and it's going to be manifested during the BRICS summit, Africa is going to it may clear the air and make clear that they're not going to tolerate interference from the Anglo-American powers. As for the BRICS currency, we're talking about a potential trading currency. It would not replace national currencies. But even so, that's very difficult to accomplish. There'll be some discussion of it at the BRICS conference, but that's a project that takes possibly years to accomplish. What is more immediate is the so-called de-dollarization, where India and Russia change do trade in rubles or in rupees, or China and South Africa might do trade in rand or in renminbi. That's going on right now, and that cuts the dollar out. So that's as much as I know about it.
Okay, fine. What we're going to do is put a a quote on the screen for both of you to look at. And this is from Winston Churchill. This is from 1937, and this is Churchill commenting on what was called the Peel Commission. It was a commission to establish what would then be the state of Israel in Palestine. So this is from him, 1937. I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. Now, this is not provided for its shock value, but it is provided from the standpoint of speaking about two matters, one of which has to do with the issue of natural resources and the fact that various nations throughout history, whether we're talking about France or we're talking about England or Portugal or we're talking about Germany, or we talk about the United States in the 1970s with its National Security Study Memorandum 200, talking about the idea of the national security implications for the United States regarding the strategic minerals and precious metals of various areas, including the continent of Africa. Whether or not the technological apartheid that you see in practice in the case of Africa takes some place like Niger, where you're talking about 85% of the population still not having electricity, despite the fact that this is a country which I think is number 3 or 4 in uranium exports. That there's something broader at work here, and of course the racial side of it is one thing, but if we say that there are injustices, and we look at this issue of technology, what's the relationship between technological progress, national independence, and social justice? This is kind of it's an implicit question coming in from various people, and rather than sort of take up each one of the questions, because it would be a little tedious, I'd just like to get your responses both to the fact that Winston Churchill said that it was 1937. It's kind of late to have that kind of view. I don't think you can really explain that on the basis of lack of knowledge. But more importantly, how do you see this question of technological apartheid playing out today, if you see it? And what should be done to use technological progress to overcome many of these injustices? So, Princy, let me start with you and see what you think of that.
Well, the statement you put on earlier on, I really don't get the narrative what the writer is trying to say, because if he says he doesn't believe that someone can, now I'm paraphrasing, can just take over a place or a country. I will say the African continent in this space. I'm just making an example, which is something that we have seen or we've witnessed in the history happening here on the African continent. You've mentioned our mineral resources actually being owned somewhere else, even though they belong to us. So I'm not sure what he's trying to get at, because that has happened. I'm not sure about what happened in India and Australia, but I'm definitely sure that in Africa, people have taken over. And the people that rule Africa are not Africans. That is, fact. And with regards to the technological advancement to progress, one of what I said when I was speaking at Africa-Russia Summit is that, the Westerns have offered African nations many solutions, including, banking system, finance system, and now they are offering the renewables energy solutions, which all those are welcomed. But if you look at countries like Russia, Russia is offering the solutions that are most important to Africa right now, which is to solve the energy poverty and using nuclear technology. So, and I don't understand why Russia is facing rejection when they just want to offer those solutions. Because if people say we are sovereign nations, like they call us all the time, why then African nations are made to choose either China, Russia, or US and Europe? Because it's not supposed to be like that. If we are sovereign nations, we are supposed to be like having cooperation agreements with any nation or any continent as Africans, because right now it's very important that the development of African nations be put as priority if this world is serious about addressing poverty. So that's just my take, to say, why should it be this one or that one? Why can't all of them come together and help Africa? I'm saying help Africa because Africa is treated as, that child that is very special and cannot do things for themselves.
Yeah, I think your answer was very clear. David?
The question itself is it's very large. First of all, yes, there were terrible injustices done, both in North America, in South America, in Africa, everywhere in the world that was part of an empire. And today there are people who are enthusiastic about reparations, but reparations is not, doesn't do enough. There's no way you can actually make reparation for those evils and those crimes. The real solution is to enable all the people to arise to a level of humanity, to become educated, to be able to participate in the political life of their own nations, And that's what the LaRouche movement is trying to do, the Schiller Institute is trying to do. And of course, there are many others around the world who understand that is the future. Now, were there other aspects that I'm forgetting of the question that need answering?
Well, I don't know if you're forgetting anything about the question. I think that the main point of it is that Winston Churchill's making an overtly racist statement defending the idea of usurping lands and for that matter, not just lands, displacing people, and for that matter, if necessary, exterminations of people. And he's saying higher races can do that because they're better. I mean, that's what he said.
Yeah. Well,
what's also relevant is that Winston Churchill did not die until 1965. He outlived JFK. And the notion that his policies or his outlook or his notions in some fashion don't apply or not important is just not the case. Matter of fact, there was a controversy at the point that Barack Obama came into office because he temporarily took the bust of Winston Churchill out of the Oval Office and put it out in another location. Some of the people from London got very upset. Then Obama said, oh, no, I love Winston Churchill. I just moved him to some place which was, more frequented by me. I go by it more. Yeah, this is actually the thing. Kynan pulled it up here. It says, the bust pen operated, maybe he removed it because he was part Kenyan. The president that the bust is placed outside his private office in the White House residence known as the Treaty Room, where he sees it every day, including on weekends. There's long rumored that Obama has sent the bust back, so forth. It says, I love Winston Churchill. I love the guy. So,
well, yeah.
So I'm not trying to talk about Obama or any of this. I'm making a different point. You have these characters like Winston Churchill, highly revered, talked about as a great hero. In fact, right now will be defended by most of the people in the United States Congress as a great person. These ideas are not unimportant to that, because there's an outlook right now that we're seeing and is clear in what we're talking about. And why are we even talking about the issue of fossil fuel usage in a continent which has far less of a carbon footprint than, as was said, individual nations in Europe? And the very fact that that discussion comes up indicates that there's something fundamentally wrong in the premises of the discussion, I think. But there are some other questions here. I just want to make sure we get to them. There's a couple that are a little bit specific. Just one in particular I'm going to pose to you, David, because you'll know what it refers to. Someone is asking, this is Ali Gur, I think is the last name, from YouTube, and he's asking how crucial projects like the North American Water and Power Alliance how crucial are projects at this time in our history to the United States. And I think what he's really saying here is, okay, you're talking about Africa, but then there's also the issue of North America or other locations. Can those kinds of projects be started in the United States? And if they can't, why not? That seems to be the basic thrust of the question. So that's why I'm throwing it to you.
Well, really what's behind Mr. Gur's question is, I think, is can the United States be converted? Can the United States return to its prior self, which was we were a country that sought the well-being of the whole world. We didn't go abroad to seek monsters to destroy, as John Quincy Adams said in 1821. He says we don't do that. But more than that, the entire BRICS program is at serious risk if the United States does not, if the U.S. elite is not converted to the idea of universal development, including in our own country, such as the North American Water and Power Alliance. And the question is, how do you do that? And I think the answer is that if we recruit the professional layers of our society to this viewpoint, if we battle it out with professors and experts and technicians and so on, and if we win them over, then we've kind of cut the legs off of the elites program.
Let me just ask. So, Princy, this one is directed at you. It says, you're in South Africa. The upcoming conference of the BRICS nations is also there in Johannesburg. Is there excitement about this process? And also, do you have a particular program for how you are going about getting youth involved in your project around nuclear power?
Thank you for that question. Yes, there's excitement about BRICS happening here next week. There's been build-up events that have been happening for the past couple of months, going towards the BRICS summit. So there are really there is excitement around the BRICS next week. Unfortunately, I'm not invited because head of states will be there, so I will not be there. So Dennis, just for you, I won't be able to give you the info about what's happening in BRICS next week because I won't be part of it. But I was lucky to be part of this week on Thursday. I was lucky to be part of an event organized by the BRICS Africa TV channel, I think, where they were launching the Chinese television. I think what's going to happen is that they are going to take the Chinese content, be it movies and everything, and translate those movies into our languages, different languages, Zulu, Sotho, here in South Africa. And then the same thing will happen where we take our content and we send it to China. It gets translated into Mandarin and people watch. So that to me is a very exciting project because it means African culture is going to be known by 1 billion population in China. That's one of the exciting projects. And other than that, I look forward to see or to just tune in the news and just watch what's happening in Sandton, Johannesburg next week. And with regards to, sorry, Dennis, I'm not done. With regards to what I'm doing to involve the youth in Africa for nuclear, I have things planned. I just don't want to jinx myself by saying them. But yeah, there's a huge program coming which is going to involve the youth. And maybe just to mention it, part of it, I think it's going to be sort of a movie, not the Robert Stone of climate change movie. It may include climate change because we cannot talk about energy and not talk about climate change. That is just a fact. It's happening all over the world. But yeah, soon I'm going to have a group of young people acting and showcasing the energy sector in South Africa.
Yeah, well, I think David is going to pull some strings with, maybe with Xi Jinping, maybe you'll pull him with Modi and see,
yes,
see what he can do to, straighten that out, straighten the situation. All right, so very good. So we're pretty much at the end of the program, and there were one or two other questions, but they were sort of answered as we were going along. So just like to get any any final thoughts about things. I guess, clearly from what we saw from Sebastian's discussion, he also had a nice picture of you in there and talked about how you were there. It's clear there's a great degree of hope. There's a lot of talk about a lot of things because of the Niger coup and the this and the that. So there's a lot more focus on Africa, which is sort of funny when you look at it from the American standpoint, because Americans don't really know much about it. They just sort of get interested because it comes into the headlines, though they're not against knowing about it either. And so kind of as we go to our concluding ideas here, what would you Princy, like to see in terms of this dialogue? And you already said in terms of China, you've made it very clear. But what would you like to see happen in America or in Europe in terms of taking a new view of both Africa and energy, and how people might help?
I'd like to see the United States acknowledging that Africa needs power, intensive power, which is not going to come from wind and solar, which is the solution, which are solutions that they currently offering. I'd like to see America also including nuclear as part of the solutions if they are really honest about wanting Africa, or if they are honest about their climate change narrative, because I don't understand if they are saying Africa does not need to pollute more, but as part of the solution, they are saying to us, don't use nuclear. I mean, US has more nuclear power plants than any other country. So I'd like to see America being, fair to us as the African continent, to say these are the solutions that have worked for us. And we also think these solutions can work for you. And most importantly, I would like to see them not encouraging the shutting down of our coal power plants, especially taking into consideration the energy crisis that we are facing as South Africa. So that's just what I would like to see America doing, to say, let's just be fair and not expect people to do what we know is not going to work. And most importantly, I'd like to see them not patronizing Africans, because I think what is happening here is that there are leaders in America who see Africans as people who cannot think. So and they have become so arrogant in their way of imposing these policies on us, as if we don't see the wrong in what they are trying to do and we cannot think altogether. So for me, it's the arrogance that I would also like to see easing a little bit, to say, I'm just not going to mention this other president, to say I liked his policies of saying just leave those shithole countries to do whatever they want to do. I think I'm at the state where, rather, if you are not willing to help us, just let us be. That's it.
That was very clear. Okay, so David, your thoughts?
I think that here in the United States, we should be challenging the mass media and challenging government spokesmen on what they say about Africa. And if we do that, I mean, challenge them along the lines that Princy just said. And if we do that, we'll be doing our own country a favor.
Thank you. Princy Mthombeni, Citizens for Nuclear, Africa for Nuclear, and David Cherry, Executive Intelligence Review. I want to thank both of you for being with us today. I think people learned a lot, and they will learn a lot more during the next coming week. We may want to have both of you come back over the course of the next few weeks to discuss more of this. I want to really thank you for what you did today. And we'll now go to our conclusion. One of the questions that came in, I'm going to answer. And because it allows for taking something up. It's a question from Thomas Bloomstein. And he asked this. He said, I want to ask a question about the term the unspeakable. And I'll explain that in a minute. And the moral task for every country, because I think, especially in this period of time, it is a task we have to take seriously again. What are your comments? Now, the term the unspeakable refers to a book called JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and the Unspeakable. But what was the unspeakable? The unspeakable was the idea that Kennedy was confronted with, that he and another individual by the name of Nikita Khrushchev had within their hands the power to destroy the entire human race. And that he was being told by generals that, for example, people like Curtis LeMay and others who were in his employ, that there were circumstances involving particularly 1962, the year 1962, and Cuba, in which Kennedy would be not only within his rights, but would have to, as a duty, carry out nuclear weapons deployments, if necessary, against the then Soviet Union. First, there would be an invasion of Cuba, and then that the Russians would not respond to that. But in fact, it was later determined that indeed the nuclear weapons that were on the island of Cuba in 1962 had actually been armed, and those nuclear weapons would most emphatically have been launched. So what Kennedy thought was unspeakable was the idea that anyone, not meaning that a president should not have that power, but that anybody should have that power over the human race, and that the notion is that you are somehow called upon to commit that crime. That is, it was an unspeakable crime. That's what unspeakable meant. So this issue was JFK and the unspeakable is the same circumstance that we all face right now when we talk about the so-called Russia-Ukraine war and the possibility of the deployment of nuclear weapons. This is something that has been being discussed by various different people. German commanders, for example, were discussing it back in 2022. There was a guy by the name of Ingo Gerhardt, who was at a symposium June 21st, and he said, quote, "For credible deterrence, we need both the means and the political will to implement nuclear deterrence if necessary." So you didn't just have Vladimir Putin saying something about nuclear weapons. This is how it was erroneously reported in the West. You had many people talking about this. You had the finance minister of France talking about financial nuclear war against Russia, which was what the sanctions were supposed to be. Bruno de la Maire is making those statements back in March of 2022. And Dmitry Medvedev responded to him by saying, be very careful in how you use your words, because although you may think you mean them in one area, we may take them to mean something in another area, meaning you could end up by even using the term financial nuclear war and provoking the real thing. So the idea of the unspeakable is the following. Do you find it unspeakable to do nothing in a world in which the danger of thermonuclear war now stands on the doorstep of each and every American, who, after all, as citizens of the United States, have powers that people do not have in Russia, do not have in China, do not have in a lot of other countries, not because of the idea that the United States is so much better than other countries, but because of the fact that the United States has the most extensive military in the world, is the only country to have ever dropped nuclear weapons on another country, and presently has a nuclear doctrine posture that calls on the United States to deploy first strike unprovoked, in fact, in that sense, including against powers that have no nuclear weapons at all. And finally, that the United States 20 years ago conducted a war in Iraq on a false pretext, which had been revealed to be false by various people, including Joe Wilson, the former ambassador, who had traveled to Niger, by the way, and had concluded that the story that Saddam Hussein had been buying yellow cake from Niger for the purpose of building a nuclear weapon was false. And it was on the basis of that story and other related stories that the United States went to war in Iraq against a country that had not attacked it. And that, according to the Nuremberg Codes, was a crime against humanity. So you have a country with all of those things I just named, and therefore the citizens of that nation have a particular and unique responsibility that no citizens anywhere else has. Other people can complain, other people can wish, but it is the American citizen that is uniquely, individually responsible for whether or not the world is going to be blown up in the thermonuclear holocaust. Not Biden, not the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party, you and me. Now, people find that unspeakable. The idea that it's their job, their responsibility, their duty as citizens of the United States to make sure that thermonuclear war is not provoked and fought by the United States. And the way that we would have to do that, people say, well, we don't have the power. I don't have the individual power to do that. Well, that's not true. That's actually a lie, actually. You do have the individual power to do that, but you find that unspeakable. And the issue involved is that you're not allowed to talk about that, not allowed to talk about it in public, not allowed to talk about it in the elections. You're not allowed to talk about it with your friends. You're not allowed to talk about it on Facebook or Twitter. Well, we say that this is the issue that is the most profound issue, and the way to address what our power is over this is exactly what is about to happen around this conference in Johannesburg. Helga LaRouche, in the statement that she is releasing, which is called Appeal to the Citizens of the Global North, we must support the construction of a new, just world economic order, is saying in that statement that if the people of the United States return to what the founders of the country proposed the United States would be in its constitution, that it promoted the general welfare of ourselves and our posterity, which did not just mean the individual people inside of the geographic area called the United States. It meant some commitment to the general welfare of humanity as a whole. If we recommitted to that, as Princy was saying earlier, there is no reason to talk about a competition or a displacement or a usurping of the rights of somebody else. Why does that always have to be the case? That was rejected in the founding of this country. And so it is by returning to the fundamental principles upon which this country was based, and you would start by allying with those people, be they from India or from South Africa or Brazil or whatever the countries may be, who are saying an investment in the productive powers of each and every individual, the right to clean water and energy and shelter and food is an inalienable right of all human beings. It has nothing to do with different systems, and that the creation of the conditions under which our nations can collaborate as a community of principle and reject war, particularly total war, as any form of solution. That no war of a total war variety can now be won, and that we therefore treat one another as human beings that should be capable of reaching for something far higher than our apparent destiny might have made necessary. That is what we can do. We can speak that truth. We can do something which can change the world. And that is within the capacity of each and every American citizen, should he or she decide that it is not unspeakable to speak the truth. Truth is speakable. It is not unspeakable. And so that is what we need to do. And that is my answer to how we should deal with this issue of the things that have become unspeakable. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to thank everybody for being with us today. I want to also point out that Helga's statement will probably be up by tomorrow or Monday. We want you to circulate it. The package also that we talked about, we'd like circulated. You'll be able to find that on the Schiller Institute site as well as the LaRouche organization site. Any questions or discussion that people have about the contents of that package, please feel free to forward us any questions, and you can be involved with us in helping to make sure that these statements are circulated and signed in various ways. So we want to thank all of you for being with us today, and we'll see you here again next week.